Considering the times that we are in right now with an unwavering pandemic and civil unrest with Black Lives Matter movement and all the police brutality and what's going on and whatnot, how do you think this election is different from any other election? What makes this election season so much more impactful than anything we've seen before?
For two reasons. One you mentioned, one you haven't. The first reason is connected to the second. We're in the middle of a global pandemic. It's killed 220,000 people in America alone and infected 8 million in about 7 months. And on top of those death rates, we do not know what the long-term impact is, even for those who've survived coronavirus. People get through it and sometimes they're fine. Sometimes they have diminished lung capacity. Sometimes they have circulation problems. Sometimes they suffer with migraines and exhaustion. And we don't know that immunity from COVID lasts more than a couple of months, even if you survive it. So it's very dangerous. It's very life-threatening. And we've never had an election, or we haven't had an election in over 100 years that had to take place under circumstances where the kinds of activities that are necessary to campaign, which is walk around, talk to people, and talk to large crowds of people, and interact with folks, and hand folks documentation, is therefore dangerous. So it completely changes how this campaign operates and adds a sort of danger and intensity to it. The second reason this is the most important election we've had is because we have a president who was not elected by the majority of the country, right? He lost by 3 million votes in 2016 and has made it very clear in everything that he has said and all of his policies and all of his hirings and appointments to positions of importance that he does not care about the democratic process. He's not interested in free and fair elections. He's not interested in expanding the franchise of voting for different kinds of people, and is an avowed white nationalist in addition to a high-level sort of military interventionist. So all those things being the case, if Donald Trump were to somehow stay in power, number one, he has absolutely no plan for dealing with the pandemic, none. His latest attempt is to say herd immunity, and that doesn't really work. So what we have now is 220,000 deaths in 7 months, could easily be 300,000-400,000 by the time we hit the spring, if he stays in office. But also, if Donald Trump manages to stay in office and isn't removed, it'll probably be the last election that we have for a good 40 or 50 years. He will appoint enough judges. He will appoint enough officials in different capacities to make it impossible for anyone other than himself or members of his family or a chosen successor, if he has one, to ever be elected president of the United States. So while you hear the cliche phrase, this is the most important election of our lifetime, I tell people, I don't say that, that depends on how you view it, but this could be the last election of our lifetime, period. If he's not removed from office, we're not getting any more free and fair elections.
Okay. And the second question I have for you is, do you think there's any change within the youth in regards to voting and their presence in the polls?
It depends on the state. There have been some numbers that suggest that youth turnout is really good. In Texas, you have 12% of the people who've early voted have no record of having ever voted before. So that's going to be a good chunk of first-time voters, in addition to a chunk of people who may have just never bothered, right? But first-time voters are a big number in Texas and Pennsylvania. You look at African-American voters in Florida, and the early voting numbers are actually down a 0.5 percentage point from where they were in 2016. It's not a good sign for Florida. And so it's not clear. I mean, young people are going to play a role. And by young, I mean people, first-time voters from 18 to 30. But whether or not they will ultimately be the difference makers in this election, it's not clear. We won't know that yet.
Mm-hmm. And then my next question for you, do you have any predictions on how, well, you kind of addressed this before in the first question, but do you have any predictions on how Biden and Trump will address the pandemic and what their consequences and their actions taken will mean, particularly for African Americans?
As of August, when I wrote a piece for the Griot about this called "What Have You Got to Lose?" It was on the 4-year anniversary of Trump speaking to a church in Michigan, I believe. Excuse me. Mm-hmm. And asking the African American community, what have you got to lose by electing him? About 22% of COVID deaths in America are Black Americans. 1 in 5, right? 1 in 5 deaths in COVID. So 230,000 people, that's a lot of Black folks. On top of that, Black people are actually dying, not just catching. Black people are dying of COVID at a rate higher than we died during the Middle Passage of being dragged from Africa to America during slavery. That's how lethal this is to us. The president does not have a plan. He lied about the impact of COVID. He then thought that COVID would only affect blue states, so he didn't care. He then said it was a hoax. Then he offered a whole bunch of cures that don't make any sense. He refused to model behavior of safety as far as social distancing and masks. He caught it himself and continued to endanger other people. And then the White House, after the president was found to be a super spreader, refused to conduct track and trace so that it's impossible to determine if someone who does end up with COVID caught it based on the White House's negligence. And then in the last 24 hours, 5 members of Vice President Mike Pence's staff have come down with COVID. So there's no plan there for anybody, white, Black, anyone, Asian, Hispanic. Joe Biden has a national plan for COVID. And he discusses that based on, the fact that the Obama administration had left a pandemic plan. And his plan mostly involves, number one, issuing sort of a national mandate on mask wearing just to shut down transmission, then introducing actual track and trace programs, hiring people to do that, and then continuing with whatever research is necessary to find a vaccine, but also making decisions about track and trace and distribution programs for the vaccine. Because even if a vaccine is discovered, if there is no organized, consistent method to get that vaccine out to the public, you'll have the same problems that you have now. We could have a vaccine today, but Donald Trump doesn't have the infrastructure and refuses to build the infrastructure in America to make that vaccine accessible. So that's the main difference in their plans. Biden actually has a plan, Trump has not.
Right, of which is to be expected considering. So next question is, when Obama was elected, many people went out and bought guns. Well, particularly white people went out and bought guns in fear that he was going to take away their right to bear arms. Mm-hmm. Today, studies have shown a lot of African Americans are now going out and buying guns. So what do you think this says about the fear we as African Americans are experiencing right now within this time period?
Gun ownership actually used to be really common in the African American community. Mm-hmm. We had to. A lot of times we were farmers. We were in rural areas. You needed guns to hunt. You needed guns for protection against the Klan and cops and just white neighbors who would attack and murder you on a regular basis. So gun ownership is not new in the Black community. What has happened is that the range of Black people who have adopted gun ownership has changed based on class and environment. So throughout the 70s and particularly the 80s and 90s, when everyone was concerned about crime and gun violence, and lots of people adopted the attitude to not own guns. They didn't think it was safe. They thought it was unnecessary as a political statement. But in an environment where you have a white nationalist president who encourages terrorists to bomb, abuse, harass, and observe the electoral behavior of Black people, Black folks are getting guns. And, anecdotally, people joke all the time that rather than protesting and crying and pushing forth legislation, if white America ever wanted gun control, they should just let every Black person in America have a gun. Suddenly they'd be really concerned about how those guns were used and administered. Mm-hmm. But that's essentially what you have happening. The country has become more dangerous in the minds of some people. They're choosing to get guns. They're choosing to get guns for protection. They're choosing to get guns to keep themselves, I guess, on par with what they know to be the case with white nationalists and white supremacist groups. So that's really where it comes from.
Okay. And my last question for you. So if this happened, if Trump does win again, I understand that you teach at HBCU, Morgan State University, and it is likely that morale among African Americans, especially African American students, the youth, people such as myself, will be particularly low if we are stuck in the same situation for the next 4 years. So what will you say to your students, or how will you approach your students if the results come out and we find out that once again we had the same president?
I would say this is pretty terrible, and we're going to have to deal with this for the next 20 or 40 years. If you look at the United States in terms, this is research of mine, you look at the United States in terms of 100-year cycles, in particular if you look at Black people, look at the 1700s, the 1800s, the 1900s, we're in the 2000s now. Excuse me. The 1820s, 18 teens, 1820s were some of the worst parts, some of the most oppressive responses to slavery and slave rebellions. It tends to go through the 1920s. We have economic downturns in the 1830s. And then it's not until the 1860s, around the Civil War, that things improve. And you have the Civil Rights Acts of the 1860s and 1870s. Things tend to improve relatively for about 40 years. And then you start getting to the 19 teens, and things got more hostile and aggressive. Then by the 1920s, summer of 1919, you had the Bloody Red Summer, you had Tulsa in 1921, you had 20 or 30, really kind of 40 years of state-sponsored violence and unknown, just unbelievable terrorism of Black people. We became refugees in our own country, the Great Migration, until the 1960s. And then there were battles and revolutions until you got to maybe around the 80s and things improved. And then we were on an upward swing, and then we started hitting the 20 teens. And you have the rise of the new right. If history is any indicator, the 2020s until the 2060s are going to be really bad, because usually the 20s to the 60s in America have been really bad. So if we're able to defeat Donald Trump, it does not mean that this stops. But if Trump manages to stay in office, it's just a reminder that just like the art and science and economics and beauty and families that we had to start in the 1830s and the 1930s, we're going to have to fight through the next 40 years.